Today we begin a long and, I hope, a cozy journey. We are not traveling to distant lands, but to a distant past, to a winter that we now only read about in books. Imagine that winter. Not the city kind, with wet asphalt and grey slush underfoot, but the real thing, when snowdrifts rise higher than a person and the air from the frost rings like a tightened string. And there, in the middle of that white, glittering but merciless silence, there stands an ordinary peasant house, squat, rooted to the ground, wrapped in snow all the way up to its tiny windows. We, children of the 21st century, are used to central heating and double glazing. Look at that seemingly flimsy wooden cabin and cannot help asking ourselves one question. The question is, how did our great-grandparents, living in those very log houses, manage not just to survive, but to sleep and raise children, while outside the log wall the cold cracked like a whip? The secret was not some special human resistance to frost. The secret was in the house, in how that hut was conceived and built. It was not merely a dwelling, it was a brilliantly worked, centuries-refined thermos. Today, in this first part, let's figure out how that thermos worked. I am Daniel Hayes, and this is Lectures Under the Moon, where we uncover old, quiet technologies that kept people alive. We begin with the walls. A thick log, especially from coniferous species like pine or spruce, is by itself a very poor conductor of heat. It breathes, but it gives up its heat grudgingly. Yet a log house is a frame of joined rounds, which means there are seams and joints. The real secret of airtightness lay in those seams, in the gaps between the logs. Those between-log gaps had to be painstakingly caulked with the best natural insulator at hand: moss. Yes, ordinary bog moss. Most often it was sphagnum or haircap moss. In autumn, people harvested it from the marshes, dried it, and then during construction they laid it layer by layer between the logs. After the frame settled, they took special wooden caulking spatulas and, with all their strength, hammered the dry moss into the cracks until it was packed tight. It was hellish work. Lives depended on the quality of that caulking. If you caulked poorly, in winter you would be admiring rime on the inner walls. Now about size. We often imagine these huts as tiny, and that is true, not only from poverty but from plain practicality. By the laws of physics, the smaller the room's volume, the faster and easier it is to heat. Why build palaces if you must burn half the nearby forest just to bring the temperature up to plus 10 degrees? And here we must remember the black and white house. We picture the neat living chamber from fairy tales, but for centuries peasant houses were smoky, that is, heated in the traditional smoky way. The stove's smoke billowed straight into the room and escaped either through a small smoke hole under the ceiling or simply through the door. Today that seems barbaric, breathing soot, but in winter it made sense. First, the smoke and the layer of soot that coated walls and ceiling like a thick, greasy skin were powerful antiseptics. Rot could not take hold in such a house. Second, and just as important, that layer of soot acted as insulation. It seemed to tan the wood, sealing the smallest pores and making the walls even less permeable to cold air. All right, we insulated the walls, but the main enemies of warmth are doors and windows. Our ancestors knew this better than we do, and they invented an ingenious engineering solution we still use. It is the unheated vestibule, the buffer we call an entry passage. How it worked is worth noting. A person never opened the outer door and stepped straight into the warm room from the frost. First, he entered the vestibule. He opened the outer door. Bang! A thick plume of frosty steam rushed in, but the inner main door to the living part remained shut. The person came in, carefully closed the outer door behind him, stood for a second, shook the clumps of snow off his clothes, and only then opened the inner door and slipped quickly into the warmth. What did we gain? The precious warm air that had filled the little log room had already drifted out into the entryway. It collided only with the cold air that lived in that unheated vestibule. That simple solution saved the lion's share of heat. The vestibule also doubled as a cold pantry, a place for everything that did not fear frost. And the windows. Have you seen real old windows? They were tiny, not because our ancestors hated light, but because every window is a hole in a thermos. In the oldest log houses, there were no windows as we think of them at all. There were simple slit windows, a small opening sawn through two adjacent logs, not meant to open, only to be slid shut from the inside with a wooden board when needed. You would pull it aside to air the room or to let out smoke. You would push it closed when it became too cold. Framed windows came later, but what did they glaze them with? Glass cost a fortune. People took either sheets of mica, which gave a dim light, or something cheaper and more available, the dried bladder of an ox. They would treat and stretch it until it let a strange, murky, yellowish light through. It was enough to tell day from night. For winter, those already tiny openings were heavily insulated. Sometimes they were simply frozen over. Folks would pour water on the outside until the window grew a thick crust of ice. That, too, held in warmth. Light in a peasant house was never abundant. The chief source became splinters of wood burning in the dark, a splinter torch that smoked and irritated the eye while giving warmth. The last line of defense against the cold, however, was floor and ceiling. The ceiling, the roof formed from logs, was insulated above with a heavy layer of dry earth, leaves, straw, sawdust, anything that could slow the upward drift of warm air. The floor inside the house was rarely freezing. Usually the house stood on a high foundation, or there was a cellar beneath it, and down in that cellar, the temperature remained above freezing all winter long. To keep the frosty wind from running under the floor, people built an earth berm around the outside of the house. This low bank, made from earth, peat, or straw, was piled up against the lower logs to close off the underfloor space from drafts. The house was wrapped at its very base in a warm blanket. Doors were cut low, thresholds high, not because our forebears were short, but to avoid losing the precious heat that gathered under the ceiling when the door opened. Entering the house demanded a small bow. That was not only a show of respect, but a practical gesture of heat conservation. Look at that. We have not even started the stove, and the house is already winter-ready. The log frame is built. Every crack has been caulked with sphagnum moss. We have shut out the cold with an entry vestibule. We made the windows tiny. We covered the ceiling with earth and wrapped the foundation with an insulating berm. We have fashioned an almost perfect thermos, a fortress ready for a long, icy siege. Yet, a thermos keeps heat only for a while. To make it truly warm, you must pour something into it. That boiling water, that sun in the midst of a polar night, was, of course, the stove, the queen of the household, the central, multifunctional hub of peasant life. How that five-star resort of a stove worked, who earned the luxury places upon its ledge, and why the stove was not only a heater, but also a healer, we will examine in the next part. Today, we are used to fireplaces in country houses. They look handsome. The open flame is cozy to watch. But the fireplace is selfish. It only warms while it crackles. It mostly warms your face while your back still shivers. Most of the heat disappears up the chimney. The peasant stove embodied a completely different philosophy. It was not merely a heater, it was a heat accumulator. Its purpose was not to give a quick blast of heat, but to store warmth and then release it slowly for hours. That is why it was enormous and very heavy. One did not simply build it, one assembled it like a sacred thing. The craft of a skilled stove builder was valued enormously, for a family's life depended on his work. Daniel Hayes. One stove took hundreds of bricks, and in the larger huts, thousands, if the family was better off, or blocks of hewn stone bound together with fat-soaked clay. That hulking mass weighed several tons. It did not stand away in a corner. It occupied the place of honor, often almost a quarter of the whole living space. It was, as it were, a house within a house, a separate fortress of warmth. The family fired that enormous structure, as a rule, only once a day, very early in the morning, when the housewife rose before dawn. Into the mouth of the stove she laid the logs. The stove roared and flared. In it they not only boiled cabbage soup and baked the day's bread, the entire giant mass of stone and clay absorbed the heat for hours, drinking it down to its very heart. Then, when the wood had burned almost to embers and the flames had shrunk to blue coals, the most critical moment came. The housewife scraped out the embers, and the stove was shut. The mouth was closed with a heavy metal damper, and high in the chimney, under the ceiling, a special cover in the flue was turned so as to hermetically seal the smoke channel. The fire went out, but the stove was only beginning to live. It stopped breathing with fire and began to breathe heat. Soft, dry, radiant heat coming off the heated clay and stone. This was not the dry, skin-parching heat of a radiator. It was deep, penetrating warmth. The stove would give that heat for the next 20, sometimes the full 24 hours until the next firing. Now we come to the main resort of the peasant hut, the warmest, most coveted, the 5-star sleeping place. This was the stove bench, heated platform attached to the stove. The stove bench, heated platform attached to the stove, was a special flat platform that formed part of the stove. Sometimes it was made directly above the vault, above the upper part of the firebox. Sometimes it was built as a separate annex on the side, with its own smoke channels. On that hot, bath brick warm surface, they laid a thick straw mattress, a homemade mattress stuffed with dry, fragrant straw, or simply flung a sheepskin with the fleece turned up. Sleeping there was hot, often so hot that people slept in nothing but their long shirts, even while frost cracked at the windows. It was like lying on the edge of a dozing volcano. Who got that luxury? Places on the stove bench, heated platform attached to the stove, were strictly regulated by the unwritten rules of the household, and they went, of course, to the most honored and vulnerable. First of all, the elderly. Old and small, they used to say in the villages, grandfather and grandmother, whose joints had long ached at any change of weather, were given the rightful privilege of warming themselves on the stove. And this was not merely indulgence, it was the main physical therapy. The stove was the village doctor, to warm old joints, to drive the aches from a sore lower back, to ease a cough. If someone fell ill or caught a chill, the first remedy was to send them to warm. A child would be bundled up in rags and laid on the warm bricks. Sweat poured in 3 streams, but with it people believed every ailment left the body. And if a man, God forbid, was seized by sciatica, they rubbed him with turpentine, vodka, and pepper, and laid him on the stove. By morning he might be able to straighten again. So the elderly on the stove bench, heated platform attached to the stove, were not a luxury, but care and medicine. The next claimants to the warm place were, of course, the very small children. Not the newborns, they stayed with their mother, but the little ones of about 5 to 7 years old. They crawled up and slept piled together like kittens. Yet this warm paradise contained a deadly danger, and its name was carbon monoxide. Colorless, odorless, it was the quiet killer of winter nights. If the housewife hurried and closed the chimney damper too soon, while embers still smoldered in the depths of the stove, the carbon monoxide would flow not into the chimney, but into the hut. People would fall asleep and not wake up. That fear was genetic. It sat in the blood. Everyone knew the stove was no joking matter. How did they guard against it? First, by experience. A good housewife knew her stove as if it were kin. She could sit for hours at the mouth, stirring the coals with the poker, until she was sure there was not a single red tongue left, until the flame had become a clean blue. Second, they were testers. They would set a bowl of water. If an iridescent, oily film spread quickly across a basin of water, it meant trouble. The deadly fumes had come. You had to open the little smoke hatch and the door into the unheated entry at once, make a through draft, and, if needed, purge the hut with cold air. In short, you had to sacrifice warmth to save lives. Paradoxically, in the older, smoke-filled huts that were heated the old black way, suffocation was almost impossible. The smoke already filled the room and was drawn into a special smoke channel beneath the ceiling, providing a constant circulation of air. The danger of carbon monoxide is the companion of the neat, whitewashed hut with its clean chimney. That was, so to speak, the high price paid for a clean ceiling and the absence of soot. So imagine the night. The southern wind howls, and the hut is silent. The heart of our house, the stove we have just fired, breathes a steady, dry heat. On the heated bench, the most honored and hottest place, the elders and the tiniest children sleep. They are comfortable. The hot bricks, the straw mattress, and the shelter provided by the stove protect them from any frost. But the hut is not empty. Families were large, 10 and sometimes even 15 people in one room, and there was only one stove. Where could the rest go? Where did the master of the house sleep? Where did the mistress sleep? Where did their grown sons sleep with their wives? Where did the marriageable girls sleep? There was not enough room on the bench for everyone. And here the real sleeping Tetris began. Our ancestors understood perfectly well that warm air from the stove always rose, and that meant you had to get as high as possible to be warm while you slept. They learned to make use of the hut's second level. What was this platform? Picture a wide, solid wooden plank, something like a mezzanine or a second floor without walls. These platforms were fixed solidly to the walls and ran in the most strategic place, from the side of the stove to the opposite wall. In that way, the platform hung right over the pocket of warm air rising from the glowing bricks. It was an economical luxury, the second most prestigious and warm place in the house. Who got it? First and foremost, it was the children's kingdom. Older children, adolescents, girls waiting to be married, all of them slept there. For one thing, it was not hard for them to climb up. Sometimes there was a small ladder for the purpose, but more often they simply clambered up directly from the stove, using it as a step. For another, it was warm. For a third, it suited the adults. All that noisy, forever tangling youth were kept out of sight while grown people sat below by the splintering light of a splinter, spinning, mending harness, or holding their slow conversations. Sleeping on the platform was a particular experience. Imagine lying in the dark, right under the ceiling, wrapped in some coarse cover. The air there was heavy and stale, scented with smoke, with dried herbs hung on the beams, and with the smell of bread. Below, adults moved like shadows, and their voices were muffled. Up there you lay in the warmth, half asleep like kittens in a basket, and slowly drifted away. Children did fall from time to time, but more often they slept in a heap, pressed tightly against one another, and there was usually nowhere to fall. Sometimes, as a precaution, they built a small rim for safety. So, the luxury spot is taken, the comfort class is occupied. The adults come down to the main floor. Where did they lie? On the floor? No, the floor was the last resort, only for a late guest, or if there simply was no space left. People slept on benches. But do not imagine the little garden seats of our dachas. The bench in a peasant house was a thing of consequence. It was a broad plank, sometimes up to half a meter thick, cut and pegged firmly into the house walls. Benches ran around the whole perimeter of the peasant hut, log house, except for the stove corner. By day they were seats. People ate and worked on them. At night they became beds. Sleeping on bare boards was hardly a luxury, but we'll get to mattresses and covers in a moment. The crucial point was that the bench was raised above the floor, and therefore warmer. There, too, was an order. The most uncomfortable, and simultaneously the most responsible, bench stood by the entrance. On that bench at the door, right in the draft, slept the head of the household, the owner of the house. Why there? Because he was the sentinel. He would be the first to hear if thieves were climbing into the unheated vestibule. He would be the first to rise if the animals needed tending in the night. He kept watch. Yes, that place was the coldest in the house, but such was his duty. Beside him, along the side wall, lay his wife, the housekeeper. Often a baby swung gently in a suspended cradle close to her. There was another clever place adjoining the stove. It was called the stove chest, wooden chest annex warmed by the stove, a large wooden chest or annex set at the mouth of the stove. It served two functions. First, it often had a door leading down into the crawl space or cellar. Second, its flat lid stayed warm, heated by the stove's side. That warm lid made the stove chest, wooden chest annex warmed by the stove, a fine place to sleep. The owner sometimes took it if he did not sleep at the door, or one of the elder sons would. You lay with your back to a warm wall. Bliss. How did everyone fit on those not particularly wide benches? Very simply. They slept in a pack, head to feet, alternating, head to someone's feet to someone else's head. This was done for two reasons. First, it squeezed more people in. Second, it was considered more decent than breathing in each other's faces all night. It was also warmer when bodies lay in a tight bundle. By the middle of the night, our peasant hut, log house, was settled. The sleeping Tetris is complete. The elders sleep on the hot stove bench. The children and adolescents, like sparrows on a perch, lie on the high platforms under the ceiling where the warm air gathers. Adults have taken the perimeter benches and the warm stove chest, wooden chest annex warmed by the stove, near the stove. The house is full. Everyone is in their place, but for now we have laid them essentially on bare planks. What were they wearing? What covered them against the night's chill, which would still find its way into the room by morning? And what did they put under their heads to see sweet dreams? We will talk about pajamas of sheepskin, straw mattresses, and heavy sheepskin coats in the next fourth part. If you're enjoying this, please like the video and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. We have placed everyone where they belong. The sleeping Tetris is in place. The elders on the hot stove bed. The children and teenagers on the lofts below the ceiling, where warm air gathers. The adults have taken the benches in the warm stove chest, wooden chest annex warmed by the stove. The peasant hut, log house, fills. Inside, they extinguished a little splinter light. The last smoky, resinous ember sinks into a clay vessel of water. Darkness comes, absolute, thick, filled with the soft breathing, the muted snoring, and the steady creak of log walls. But remember, we have tucked our ancestors in, essentially, on bare boards, and that, you will agree, is not the most comfortable rest. Let us now sort out what they wore. What did they actually lie on and cover themselves with against the night chill that, as the stove cooled toward morning, would seep into the far corners? Let us begin with night clothes, and at once dispel one widespread myth. Did they sleep as they were born? Naked? Almost never. 3 solid reasons prevented that. The first is plain cold. Yes, it was hot by the stove. On the high platforms it was warm, but the man sleeping at the door stayed in the coldest zone. By morning, the floor still drew a chill. The second reason was shame and decency. Do not forget, a single room contained everyone: parents, children, often a daughter-in-law, the wife of the eldest son together with her mother-in-law and father-in-law, young women to be married, brothers. It was a genuine communal sleep. Undressing in such circumstances was unthinkable. It was a disgrace. And the third reason was practicality. Why remove clothes when you could sleep in them? So the pajamas were the day clothes, or rather, their underlayer. At the core, for both men and women, was a long linen shift. It was at once underwear, house dress, and nightshirt. Linen is a genius material. It breathes, it soaks up sweat, and there is a lot of sweating at night, especially on the stove. And it even has mildly antiseptic qualities, which was literally life-saving. Women slept in those long linen shifts. Men wore a shorter shirt and plain, coarse trousers. They usually took off only the outermost, filthiest work garments and their bast shoes or boots. And in those very shifts, still soaked with the day's sweat and smelling of torch smoke and home, people went to bed. That shirt became a second skin. Now where to put that shirt? What served as a mattress? Sleeping on a bare, though polished to a shine, wooden bench is hard. In the poorest families, a man might simply fling his outer coat under his side and fall asleep. But for a lasting place to sleep, something better was needed. That something was the straw mattress. It is not our spring mattress. The straw mattress is, in essence, a large, very densely packed sack made from coarse burlap. They stuffed that sack with straw. Yes, ordinary dried straw. Rye straw was preferred. It is long, soft, and resists compacting for a long time. Imagine this mattress. First, it rustles. Every movement, every turn from side to side answered through the whole hut with a dry, ringing whisper. Second, it smells. In a locked room in winter, a straw mattress kept the dry, bitter fragrance of the harvested field. In summer, it could be prickly. The sharp ends still poked through the fabric, and it quickly flattened. And, sadly, it absorbed every smell and became a refuge for small creatures, which we will discuss later. But it had 2 priceless qualities. It was warm, straw is an excellent insulator, and it was free. Once a year, the compacted old straw was shaken out of the mattresses. the sack covers were washed, aired, and sun-dried, and in the autumn they refilled them with the fresh, fragrant straw of the new harvest. The mattress was clear, but what about under the head? A pillow. A soft pillow in our modern sense was a luxury. A feather pillow or a down-filled pillow was almost currency. It was the central part of a girl's dowry. From childhood, a girl gathered goose and hen down, feather by feather, for years to sew pillows and a feather mattress or feather bed in time for her wedding. Those pillows were kept in a chest and displayed to guests as a symbol of prosperity. In everyday life, however, households made do with whatever they had. Most often, people used a bolster, a smaller, straw-filled mattress, tightly packed with the same straw, or simply rolled up some useless garment for a headrest. Old people sleeping on the stove often used a wooden headrest built into the upper sleeping platform, so sleep was, to be frank, hard. And finally, the coverings. Forget light quilted blankets. The primary cover was the outer winter clothing. The king among those covers was the sheepskin coat. This was not simply a coat. The sheepskin kaftan was a long garment made from several sheepskins, fur inside, cloth or leather outside. It could be as long as 5 sheepskins laid together. It was unbelievably, unimaginably warm and equally heavy. A good sheepskin coat could weigh as much as 16 kilograms. When the family on the bench wrapped themselves in the master's sheepskin coat, it was an event. That cover did not merely warm, it trapped heat. It lay on top like heavy, warm armor. Under it, the air was hot, still, and utterly calm. You were protected. The smell of that coat, sheepskin, resin, sweat, frost, and smoke, was the smell of home. Often husband, wife, and children slept together under the same sheepskin coat. That was simply warmer. There was also the felted wool blanket, made not by weaving, but by fulling, thick, dense, like our modern felt rug. It holds heat with a vice-like grip. Poorer families made do with the roughest, prickly fabric, something like tarpaulin, and that, too, had to serve as blanket and shield. And, of course, everything that had hung on the hooks during the day came into play. Old kaftans, every piece of outerwear. They were piled on top, creating a many-layered cake. Now the picture is complete. Night, the peasant hut, log house. On the platform beds, on the narrow bunks and on the benches, on straw mattresses, and still wearing their sleeping shirts, people lie. They are covered with 1 or 2 heavy sheepskin coats, pressed close to one another for warmth. At first glance, it looks chaotic, a motley heap. But it is not. Even in this apparent common sleep, there ruled the strictest order. There was an invisible yet unbreakable hierarchy. I will speak in our next, 5th part about why the master slept by the door and the daughter-in-law was put in the farthest corner, who had the right to sleep in the red corner and who slept under the bench. For now, the peasant hut, log house, seems to have fallen asleep. On the heated bench, on the platform beds and the benches, people lie wrapped in heavy sheepskins. To the untrained eye, it might look like confusion, a tumble of bodies sleeping in a heap pressed against each other. That is only at first glance. In fact, in this nocturnal Tetris, the sternest, unwritten, and inviolable order prevailed. A true social charter. Every sleeping place had its status, and that status was determined not by who got there first, but by age, position in the family, and even by sex. Let us unravel this nightly hierarchy. We begin with the head of the household. We remember that he got, perhaps, the least comfortable spot. He slept on a bench by the entrance. There, however, the doorway was corked. The cold still crept in by morning. There, the draught ran along the feet. Why? It was not punishment, but duty. The master was the night watch. He was the frontier guard, the ice sentinel sleeping on the border between the warm world of the family and the chaos of the frosty gloom in the entry passage. He had to be the first to hear if thieves tried to get into the vestibule at night. He had to be the first to jump up if, God forbid, the oven cracked or the livestock in the byre became restless. He slept lightly. His place was not a privilege, but a responsibility. Nearby, but a little farther from the door, in a warmer zone, lay the mistress of the house. Her place was movable, and it was determined by her main concern at night, the infant. Where did the smallest child sleep, in a cradle or a cradle basket? It was almost never placed on the floor, that was too cold. The cradle was hung from a ceiling beam, a hanging cradle. Why that arrangement? It was a brilliant solution. First, the air above was warmer. Second, the child was safe from mice and from a curious cat. Third, the mother could rock the cradle without leaving her bench. Often a cord or a special foot pedal was attached to the cradle. If the baby fussed, the mother, half asleep and without opening her eyes, would tug the cord. Silence would return. Thus, the mistress slept on watch near the cradle and as close to the oven as convenient, so that she could quickly warm the child's milk or a decoction in the night. The elders had already been put to bed. They received honor and respect. Their place was the heated bench, the warmest spot. This was not up for discussion. From there, the situation became even more interesting. Older children, as we have noted, slept on the platform beds. But in the household there were also daughters-in-law, the wives of the elder sons who lived under the same roof with the father and mother-in-law. The daughter-in-law, especially a young woman newly come to the family, occupied a subordinate position. She was allotted a place by residue, often pushed into the so-called women's nook by the stove, where pots and hooks stood. There, on some little perch, or even simply on the floor atop a straw mattress, she slept, farther from the eyes of the father-in-law. Decorum demanded it. Adult, unmarried sons slept on the remaining benches, often laid out like a pack to make room and to avoid breathing on each other. Lastly, there was a special category, the guest. Hospitality was sacred. A guest in the house was like God in the house. The place where guests were put to sleep was a signal of the greatest respect, or, conversely, of neglect. If an honored guest arrived, an esteemed bridegroom, a distant relative, an important person from the town, he was given the best place. So, the night in the peasant hut, log house, was not randomness, but an ordered arrangement of duties, respect, and necessity. Bodies, bedding, and ritual all fit together into a system that, to the outside eye, might look like disorder, but in reality was the household's way of surviving the long, cold night. No, not the stove bed. That belonged to the family. He was given the red corner. The red corner was the sacred spot of the house where the icons hung. By day, it held the dining table. At night, the bench in the red corner was dressed in the cleanest linen. They gave the guest the best pillow, the very down-filled one from the dowry, and covered him with the sturdiest sheepskin coat. To sleep beneath the icons was considered a great honor. A guest found himself under a kind of divine protection, and the hosts showed him their highest regard. If the visitor was uninvited, a wanderer, a beggar asking only for a night for Christ's sake, he was taken in, of course. To throw a person back into the frost was a mortal sin, yet they did not put such a guest on the same place as the master. He slept by the threshold, on the bench where the head of the household usually slept, or even simply on the floor right at the door. This was the message. We warm you,
We save your life, but you are a stranger from the outside world, and your place is on the border. By midnight, the household hierarchy was fully arranged.
The master kept watch by the door. The mistress sat by the cradle. The elders basked in the warmth on the stove. The young people slept on the raised pallets, and the daughters-in-law retreated to their corner. The honored guest rested in the red corner. The incidental guest lay at the threshold. Everyone knew their place. It was an age-old order. Now the peasant hut, log house, truly falls asleep. The darkest, quietest part of the night arrives. Idyllic, it seems. Comfort, warmth, safety, order. But we promised a truthful lecture, and we must be honest. A few details are missing from this picture, because the hut, besides its human inhabitants, sheltered other residents. Uninvited, but constant. The aromas locked inside this fortress until spring were such that we, softened by modern life, can hardly imagine them. Whether the peasant hut, log house, was stuffy, who the tiny creatures behind the stove were, and how the peasants fought, or did not fight, bedbugs, we will discuss in our next 6th part. Back in the warm peasant hut, log house, the elders on the stove, children breathing in the warm air beneath the ceiling, adults lined up on benches in strict order. The house was full. The splinter torch had been extinguished. In the dark, lit only by the dying embers in the stove, idyll seems to reign. The very scene we see on cheap folk prints. Peace, rest, warmth, and safety in the middle of an icy desert. Yet we agreed to tell the unvarnished truth, and it is time to dispel a few cozy myths. That idyll was very particular. If we, people of the 21st century, suddenly found ourselves in that sleeping hut, we would be astonished, and not with delight. Two major realities are missing from the picture: the real smell and the real neighbors. Start with the myth of frost-fresh air. We imagine that if it is -30 outside, the house must be cool and bracing. Far from it. The main problem of a peasant night was not cold, but suffocating stuffiness. Terrible, stagnant air. Remember how we began. The peasant hut, log house, is a thermos. Its purpose was not to let heat out, so it was hermetically sealed for the whole winter. The tiny windows, remember, and the ox bladder glazing. We sealed them for winter, either with dough or by freezing ice into them. The chimney was closed with a plug, otherwise all the heat would simply fly up the flue. The door to the cold vestibule was opened only in extreme need, and only for an instant. No ventilation at all. Now imagine what 15 people breathed inside that enclosed tin can. The air in the hut was dense. It was a cocktail. First, there was soot. Even if the stove was working properly, for light they burned the splinter torch, a thin, resinous sliver that smoked and blackened mercilessly. Second, kitchen odors. The sour tang of fermented rye beverage left standing in the cask, the smell of sauerkraut, onions, garlic, and boiled porridge. Third, the smell of people. They bathed in the steam bath perhaps once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, and they slept in the same shirts they wore during the day, shirts soaked with sweat. Add the heavy scent of sheepskins from the coats. Add the damp, musty reek of straw from the mattresses. It was thick, stagnant, very lived-in air. That was the true night inside the winter hut. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. He was not fresh, but he was warm. and warmth. That was life. The choice between freshness and death from cold was obvious. But there were other neighbors, and I do not mean those behind the wall. I mean those who lived behind the stove. Every peasant hut harbored its parallel life. The first and most numerous of those neighbors were, of course, the cockroaches. There were many of them, an awful lot. Paradise for them lay behind the stove. Constant warmth, darkness, and a perpetual trail of dinner crumbs. Yet people did not treat them as we would, as a sign of filth or disgust. On the contrary, a cockroach in the house was a sign of plenty. They were called God's creatures. There was a folk omen. If cockroaches suddenly left the house, expect trouble. Either a fire or famine. So they were regarded philosophically, like the cat or the mice under the floor. Part of the place. Another sort of neighbor, however, inspired fierce hatred and relentless war. The bedbugs. These were a real scourge. They did not live behind the stove. They lived next to people, in the grooves of the logs, in the gaps under the benches, and, of course, in the folds of those very straw mattresses. At night they fed, and that itch, those bites, that unsettled sleep, that was the reality of a winter night. Summer made the fight easier. Mattresses and clothes were laid out in the sun and baked clean. In winter, there was one radical method. It was called freezing out. Once a month, in the fiercest frost, the whole family evacuated. They went to neighbors, or, more often, to the hot village steam bath. In the hut, every interior door and any windows that opened were thrown wide. Straw mattresses, sheepskin coats, and benches were hauled out into the cold. The hut became, for several hours, an ice cave. This total frost killed both adult bedbugs and their eggs. Afterwards, the house was closed up again and warmed from scratch. Only in that way could one buy a few weeks of restful sleep. There were other temporary neighbors. When the frost bit down to its limits, to -40 degrees, a farmer could not abandon the most vulnerable animals to die in the cold shed. A newborn calf, or 2 or 3 lambs, or a piglet, would be brought inside the hut. A corner by the very entrance was curtained off for them, the coldest spot, oddly enough, a handful of straw thrown in, and they spent the winter with the family. So the bouquet of smells in the hut acquired a sharp barn odor, and the night sounds now included the calf's breathing or the lamb's bleat. And then there were conveniences. Of course, these were in the yard. A small wooden outhouse. Now imagine a night in complete darkness and -35 degrees. To crawl out from under a heavy sheepskin coat, fumble for bast shoes and the outer fur, unfasten the creaking door into the entry, and then step outside. That was an act of daring. People tried not to go out at night. The solution was a bucket or a chamber pot, if the household had one. It would be placed either in the entry, if it was not too cold, or right by the threshold inside the hut. By morning, the aroma inside the human thermos had become, of course, even richer. This is the picture. Not romantic, not quaint. It was a night full of stuffiness. A night smelling of smoke, then straw and livestock. A night in which one had to share the bed with uninvited neighbors. It was a night of survival, and the price of warmth, of life itself, was like this. The choice was simple. This, or freezing to death. Our ancestors, of course, chose life. But that night was long, viscous, noisy. Someone snored, someone coughed, an infant cried, the calf sighed. Still, the winter night ended, and the winter day, though short, demanded work. In our concluding 7th part, we will talk about who rose first in that icy dark, how the morning began, and how that enormous hive of a house woke. The night was deafening, long and thick as resin. Behind the log walls, the frost reached its peak. Those pre-dawn hours, when the cold bites the hardest, found the hut quiet. But it was no longer the warm silence of the evening. The heart of the house, the stove, had cooled. It had given up all the heat it had stored during the day. Now, real cold inched into the corners by the windows. Everyone who had slept on the bench by the door drew up their legs and buried their nose in the collar of the sheepskin. Even up on the sleeping platforms beneath the rafters, the evening closeness had gone. The air had grown cool and sharp. Frost had rimed the tiny window panes from the inside and iced the iron fittings at the door. All of the living warmth trapped in the house thermos had contracted, gathered into one concentrated place beneath the heavy sheepskin blankets where the people lay pressed together. To push an arm or a leg out into that air was an act of courage. And in that ringing, cold silence, with dawn still far off, winter mornings come late, another sound appeared. A dry, straw-like rustle of the straw mattress. The straw-filled mattress. Who rose first? Not the master. He would go out to the animal feed later. Not the children. They slept until the light called them. First, in that icy darkness, always rose the woman, the housewife, the elder woman. It was her sacred duty to relight the heart of the home. Imagine that, waking. It was not our gentle, waking stretch in a warm bed. It was a lurch from life into cold. She tossed back the edge of her heavy sheepskin coat, and a blast of icy air hit her. Bare feet met the cold floor, and the board by the door, where she often slept, was especially frigid. Feeling each step, shuffling so as not to wake the others, she moved toward the stove. Her nightshirt clung like a second skin. The dark was absolute, but she knew every corner by touch. Her hand found the container for firewood, the little bundle prepared the night before, and the light stick laid ready. She found the fire steel and a flake of flint and tinder that had been dried, a bit of fungus she had prepared, or a charred shingle. A scrape, a strike, the sound of metal on stone. A dry spark flew. It landed on the tinder. In a heartbeat, the ember glowed. Then the light stick caught. It crackled, throwing a trembling red glow across the soot-stained walls and the sleeping faces. The first fire of a new day. Now, the main task. To wake the stove. She pushed open the heavy damper at the stove mouth. A sour, cold breath of yesterday's chimney came out.
She opened the small smoke hatch in the flue to give the draft room. Into the belly of the stove went the wood, only dry logs, stacked the evening before and left to dry on the stove itself, and birch bark for the initial flare. The flame leapt to the logs. The stove began to stir and hummed. That low, throaty murmur of the waking oven served as an alarm for the whole household. Darkness retreated. More light filled the room. The crackle of burning wood became audible. The peasant hut, log house, filled with the most morning, most homely smell. Birch or pine smoke. At that sound, the master on his bench would begin to stir. He grunted, hauled himself up, threw the sheepskin coat over his nightshirt, put on felt boots if they were there, or wrapped footcloths and donned bast shoes, and took the buckets. His path led through the unheated entry and out to the barn, the dark, cold stall, where the plaintive bellow of a hungry cow and the bleating of sheep awaited him. The animals had to be watered,
and water still had to be fetched from the ice-choked well. Fodder had to be given. It was hard, blind labor in vicious cold. Inside, the others woke. Children on the lofts began to fidget and jostle. The elders on the heated platform slid their legs down. The morning rituals began. Washing. In the corner hung the wash urn, a simple clay pitcher with 2 spouts. Beneath it, a wooden basin. The water left in the bucket by the door overnight had frozen over with a crust of ice. They broke the ice. With that icy water, they quickly rinsed face and hands. The shock swept away the last remnants of sleep. No hot shower, only brisk, searing cold. That was it. Night was over. The housewife set a cast-iron pot on the stove with the morning porridge. The master returned from the yard, crusted with frost and flushed from the cold. Children clambered down from the lofts, and the peasant hut, log house, filled fast with the living warmth thrown off by the now roaring oven.
A short, hard winter day began. When we look back over all of this, we understand that sleep in the peasant dwelling was not pleasure or rest in our sense. It was not an escape from reality. It was a survival strategy. It was ritual. It was a way to get through the dark, cold time, to conserve precious heat and strength. It was the cycle that let them meet another dawn and go on living in spite of everything. With you was Daniel Hayes. See you in the next episode of Lectures Under the Moon. Please like and subscribe. I'm Daniel Hayes. Thank you for watching Lectures Under the Moon. See you in the next lecture.